Hello everyone, my name is Xiomaro and welcome back to the channel. So with the official release of Role Queue and Sigma, I thought now might be a good time to make a guide on playing Sigma. He won't be playable in competitive until early September I believe, but I know that a lot of you will want to start learning him in the new and improved quick play already. For the record, I've played around 30 hours on Sigma at Masters rank on the PTR. This guide will go beyond the absolute basics of the character and should hopefully help fast track you to playing Sigma competently. It's going to be a fairly comprehensive guide and there really is quite a lot to learn with Sigma, so let's just jump straight into it. Now, I'm going to start with a few meta topics because I think it's important to go through that first. There's been a lot of misunderstandings surrounding the hero and I guarantee that will continue and even be amplified as he enters general release. So let's start by talking about whether Sigma is an off tank or main tank. The more I play Sigma, the more I think he genuinely can be played in both roles. However, I do think he looks best as a main tank right now. He's pretty situational and has some pretty hard counters, but in the right situation, he is very strong. As a main tank, he pairs really well with Zarya or D.Va. Zarya is definitely all round the best off tank for Sigma, but D.Va definitely has some situations where she'll work well too. When you play Sigma as a main tank, you need to focus your barrier usage on protecting the bulk of your team more and understand that you are the one who needs to press W and make space. As an off tank, I think he pairs best with either Orisa or Wrecking Ball. With Orisa, Sigma has the flexibility to use his shield more aggressively. Because the Orisa shield should be protecting the bulk of the team, that frees you up to focus your shield placement on denying enemy snipers, taking duels on the objective, and reactively protecting teammates who get knocked out of position. In this comp, Sigma plays like a kinda alternative D.Va. The downside is the lack of vertical mobility. The plus side is that Sigma is a much better duelist than D.Va, so he's great for solo contesting points when there's a sneaky flanker, for example on Paris point A defense. He also gives Orisa comps a setup ultimate, which isn't possible with D.Va or Roadhog. When you play Sigma with Wrecking Ball, you basically want to aggressively take the space that Wrecking Ball creates. Wrecking Ball moves people out of the choke, and you move into that space with your team and follow up on his slams, while focusing a lot more on team peel than you would as a main tank. There's a little bit more to it than that, but I think I'll have to save team synergies for another day. As for the more suboptimal picks, I think his worst pairing by far is Winston. There's just no synergy there at all. Reinhardt and Roadhog are also pretty bad with Sigma, but that's more down to opportunity cost. If you're running Reinhardt, Zarya is just so much better, and with Roadhog, you're probably better off just playing Orisa. Next, let's take a look at when you should play Sigma. I feel like this is important to understand because Sigma seems to have been designed to have some pretty hard counters from the get-go. Long story short, pretty much any kind of dive counters Sigma comps. Against Wrecking Ball, you might have a little bit more counterplay if you can land your accretion on him, but against a good Hammond, that won't be easy. Against Winston D.Va, just switch, dude. Unless your team outclasses the enemy to such a huge degree, you're just going to get wrecked. Not only does Winston's bubble and defense matrix block almost all of your damage and peel, Sigma is the only main tank with no armor. Winston and D.Va usually do pathetic damage against tanks because of armor. Sigma, by comparison, gets melted by Winston and D.Va, and that's not even mentioning the dive DPS that screw you over. Hackfist dive is an insanely strong counter to Sigma, so if you end up against Doomfist Sombra dive, just throw in the towel and switch heroes. Rein Zarya is something of a map-dependent matchup. If you're forced into situations where you need to get into Reinhardt's swinging range, Sigma just straight up loses. And if that's the case, you're probably not going to be able to take space from him. If, on the other hand, you're on a map where Sigma can constantly rotate around Reinhardt and stay out of his effective range, you might be okay. I think Rein Zarya comps are definitely favoured against Sigma comps, but it's not a hard counter like divers. It's much more map dependent. Sigma's real strength, however, is into Orisa Hog. You still need a map that allows you to rotate around the bunker a bit, but if the map has the space for you to do so, you're going to have a really good time against them. Think Paris point A. If you use your shield and kinetic grasp to get through the choke and rotate round to the left, with your massive AoE damage and the help from your team, you can quite easily dismantle the bunker. In my opinion, Sigma seems to work better on attack, purely based on the fact that he can be so hard countered. If you run Sigma on defense, you're potentially making your team vulnerable to dive. One thing I will say is that the dive meta was so long ago now that it almost feels like people have forgotten how to play it correctly. But if you do end up against a group of players who can pull off dive tanks and Doomfist Sombra, you're kinda screwed. So with the meta stuff out of the way, let's take a look at his kit and explain how you should play him. First up, HYPERSPHERES. This is Sigma's primary fire and the source of almost all of his damage. This fires 2 gravity balls at a time that fly 20 meters before exploding. and that explosion effectively extends its range to 23 meters, although you won't be doing full damage like that. They can also bounce off surfaces like Junkrat's grenades, but with a straight line trajectory. Each sphere does 60 damage, so if you hit both, that's 120 damage. On impact, or at max range, the spheres explode, dealing between 10.5 and 30 AoE damage per sphere. Sigma also takes self-damage from the AoE effect. It's not a huge amount, but definitely be aware of that if you're spamming someone close up. So here are some useful things to know with his primary fire. First of all, you can melee as the second sphere comes out to add an extra 30 damage when you're in range. This is really great against Tracer or a D-Mech Diva, as it actually one-shots them. You should get in the habit of doing this against all heroes though. If they're in range, always use melee. You might have heard people say that Sigma's ultimate builds really slowly, but honestly, when you play him right, it can actually build pretty fast. If you're only ever hitting single targets or spamming shields, then yes, it does build painfully slowly. But if you're throwing hyperspheres into a group of enemies, you can usually get your ult every couple of fights. If it is taking you 4 minutes to get Gravitic Flux, you're either playing him wrong, or you're playing him into a comp that he just doesn't work against. It's also worth noting that Sigma does 72 damage per second against shield. That puts his shield break above Winston and Reinhardt because, well, neither of them have any shield break, but it puts him well below every other tank. For that reason, you don't ever want to get into an extended shield battle. One notable exception is Orisa Sigma, where you kinda just win every shield battle by default. But even then, you really want to find an off angle and get some AoE hero damage in to build your ultimate. If you're spending a lot of time spamming shields, there are better picks than Sigma. Literally all of the off tanks do at least double the shield break Sigma can offer. On the other hand, if you are rotating around shields and doing AoE damage, Sigma actually has the highest sustained damage potential of any tank. Unless you're playing with one of the really high damage DPS heroes like Junkrat, Pharah or Hanzo, don't be surprised to see yourself with gold damage quite a lot. So because of the AoE splash damage, its ability to bounce off walls, and the fact that it's slow but bursty damage, a good technique is to corner peek without shield and do some quick unpredictable damage. Likewise, you can throw spheres into a small room much like Junkrat would. It has basically the same effect. If you can't rotate around the shields, you should try to use wall bounces to get damage around the shields. A little tip that can help your aim with Sigma is to aim just in front of people's feet, kinda like how Hanzo's old scatter arrow worked. I don't know why, but it feels easier to hit direct spheres that way. This only really works on perfectly flat surfaces though. If there's any gradient or any sort of map geometry, it's hard to get your shots to go where you want them. Another piece of advice is to really take your time when aiming. Sigma's single target sustained damage is pretty mediocre, but the burst is great. So for that reason, don't feel like you have to shoot as fast as possible. Just take your time and try to land direct hits. Next, let's move on to his experimental barrier. The best way to understand his shield is probably to compare it to Reinhardt's, as it's the most similar. Sigma's shield can take 1,500 damage compared to Reinhardt's 2,000. After 2 seconds of being down, it recharges at 175 per second compared to Reinhardt's 200. And just like with Rein's shield, if it fully breaks, it goes on a 5-second cooldown. You never want to let it fully break. So in a vacuum, Reinhardt's shield kinda looks better. However, Sigma has some advantages over Reinhardt. First of all, Reinhardt moves at half speed while holding the shield, unless he shield hops. Sigma, by comparison, can move at full speed, reposition shield, and deal damage all at the same time. This means Sigma can move into and take free space more quickly, aggressively, and safely than Reinhardt. For that reason, as Sigma, if the enemy gives you an inch, you need to take a mile. Take that space and take it fast. His shield also has a slight curve. It's not huge, but it is something. And perhaps most importantly, the shield can be moved at 16.5 meters per second and thrown in any direction. That gives it some applications that Reinhardt simply doesn't have access to. Let's give you some examples of useful tech with the barrier. In most situations, if you're the main tank, you'll want to keep the shield in front of you and your team. However, if the enemy team is all in one spot, it can sometimes be more useful to put the shield right in front of the enemy team instead of your team. Likewise, if the only threat is on the high ground, you can use your shield to deny a position from the enemy. When you shield something, whether it's the main team or a sniper on the high ground, you need to use that shield time to move. Sigma's shield isn't meant to stay in one place for a long time, so you need to think about why you're shielding something and what you're trying to achieve with it. For example, if you place your shield to deny a high ground angle from the enemy, they can quite easily just move away from your shield and continue shooting you. You want to use that short window of opportunity while they're moving around the shield for your team to move. Don't just place a shield and expect a problem to go away. For example, against a Widowmaker, if you throw your shield in her face, get your team to move up to hard cover before she can reposition. Sigma comps should be moving around quite a lot, so Lucio is a really strong pick with Sigma. Speed boost means you can move further during that short window of opportunity. It's also worth mentioning that the off-tank often plays a greater role in taking space than in other comps. For example, your Zarya might end up playing in front of you a lot more than she would with Reinhardt, and that's totally fine due to your shield mechanics. Just make sure you put your shield in front of her after she uses her personal bubble. Another thing to bear in mind when playing with Zarya is how important it is to let her get energy. It's so easy as Sigma to screw her out of any bubble value with your barrier and kinetic grasp, and particularly in this comp it's so important for Zarya to get charge. So if the Zarya pushes in front of you, please fight your inner urge to put your barrier in front of her right away. If she has her personal bubble, let her move forward and use it. I'd love to go into more detail about how to play the Sigma Zarya combo, but that would require another video in itself. I'll just say that it's a lot less flowcharty than the Rein Zarya comp, making it harder to pull off, but the benefit is how great their mid-range sustain and pressure is. In general, I feel like you need to come at Sigma's barrier with an off-tank mindset. If your DPS push ahead of you, reposition your barrier to protect them. Unlike Orisa and Reinhardt, where DPS are expected to stay with you most of the time, Sigma actually affords your DPS teammates the flexibility to push more aggressively, especially when you have a Zarya bubble as well. If your DPS have more mobility than you and end up pushing ahead of you sometimes, that's totally fine. Just put your barrier in front of them and press W with them. That's not to say that you shouldn't be at the front, because you'll often still be the guy to lead the charge, but Sigma does have that flexibility to protect from afar, much like an off-tank. Something else I should mention about Sigma's shield is that you should be constantly moving it. Please don't use it like an Orisa shield. If you're gonna do that, just play Orisa. Something that Sigma's shield is really great at is baiting cooldowns. By flicking the shield on and off, you can often bait out hooks, helix rockets, and even earth shatter. If you just leave it up permanently, the enemy will just burn through it and mop the floor with you. By moving it at somewhat unpredictable intervals, you can often bait the enemy into wasting their cooldowns. For example, against Roadhog, as long as I'm aware of where he is, I've had a lot of success baiting and denying his hooks. Sigma's a very good answer to Roadhog in general, actually. Another tip for both you and your team is to shield dance much like Orisa or Winston would. Against beam weapons, this is your only option once they're close. And actually, contrary to what I've been saying so far, there is one time where it's okay to leave your shield out. Once you're in a proper team fight and the enemy aren't all in one easily shieldable direction, your best course of action might be to just place your shield, leave it there for a bit, and shield dance. This works particularly well against enemy Zaryas, Roadhogs, Reapers, Tracers, and all that kind of stuff once you're up in each other's faces. And the final tip is to get in the habit of alternating primary fire and shield. You can fire and move at full speed while repositioning your shield at the same time using this technique. When you're moving up and taking space, unless there's a threat of your team getting one-shot by snipers, you should use this technique liberally. Not only does it save on shields while you're pushing up, but it also helps bait cooldowns like I mentioned before, and it means you can keep re-angling your shield to protect your team from the most dangerous threats. Just be careful not to get into an obvious rhythm. If your shield flicking is too predictable, the enemy can just time their abilities to hit while your shield is down. Next, let's take a look at Kinetic Grasp. This ability works in a similar way to D.Va's Defense Matrix. However, the effect doesn't extend nearly as far as Defense Matrix, and it can't be turned on and off. It has a fixed duration and cooldown. The only exception to that is that it can be interrupted by using Accretion if you wish to do so. One notable difference with Kinetic Grasp compared to Defense Matrix is its ability to block Roadhog's hook and Brig's whipshot. So long as you don't get stunned out of Kinetic Grasp, 40% of the damage absorbed during its duration will be converted into a temporary shield, up to a maximum of 400 shield health. Mechanically, it works kinda similarly to Doomfist shields, but the decay numbers are a little different. The shield lasts for 3 seconds and then starts to decay at 7 per second. Some useful tech with Kinetic Grasp includes stuff like reactively blocking Roadhog hooks, and that's just another way that Sigma counters Roadhog. Be aware though, there is a short window of time as your Kinetic Grasp ends that Roadhog can hook you before you get your shield back up, so try to get behind hard cover before Kinetic Grasp ends. Predicting and eating Grav, Blizzard and other ults can be pretty clutch, but eating projectile ults is way harder than with Defense Matrix. Personally, I find it more reliable to save it for things like Death Blossom or Whole Hog, but you can definitely try to eat grabs in a pinch. Something you should remember is that you can retrieve your barrier while Kinetic Grasp is active, and it's usually a good idea to do so long as it isn't going to get your team killed. The duration of Kinetic Grasp and the personal shield you get afterwards buys you a little time for your barrier to recharge, so definitely take the opportunity to do so. Kinetic Grasp is best for dealing with high bursts of damage and predictable spam. I already mentioned Whole Hog and Death Blossom, but it's also really useful against Bastion, Junkrat Spam and Hanzo's Storm Arrow. Something I always look out for is if Hanzo tries to burn my shield with Storm Arrow, as long as it's not going to get my team killed, I'll often drop shield and Kinetic Grasp. Doing this is a great way of turning the momentum of an initiation. Spammy damage like that into your shield will force you to slow down or retreat. Eating that spam with Kinetic Grasp reverses it by giving you a hefty personal shield to push with. Something to be aware of is getting stunned out of Kinetic Grasp. Accretion from an enemy Sigma will knock you out of it and you won't get the personal shield. Likewise, a hook or stun from an off angle will also interrupt Kinetic Grasp. You really need to be aware of where your opponents are when you use this ability. It's not nearly as reliable as Orissa's Fortify, so don't charge into a fight thinking Kinetic Grasp will save you, because it won't. Next, let's take a look at Accretion. This ability is one of the main threats that Sigma provides. I feel like effective use of this ability is what separates a good Sigma game from a mediocre one. Accretion does 80 damage, 15 to 50 splash damage, and between 7.5 and 25 self damage depending on how close you are. It also knocks enemies down for between 0.5 and 3 seconds, depending on how far away they are. At a distance, this is literally like a solo Earth Shatter. Even up close, it's a decent interrupt, and it also has a huge hitbox. This means you need to be a bit careful when you're using it through doorways or close to walls, because it's really easy for it to hit that wall and waste it. But it also means that it's relatively easy to land. You move very slowly while casting Accretion, so you need to be a bit careful, but your opponents should fear being hit by this thing. Good use of it will force your opponents to respect your space. If you land it on a 200 HP hero, followed by 2 direct spheres, it's an insta-kill. Even landing it on a tank can be equally devastating with a bit of follow-up. The counterplay is that it can be blocked by shields, bubbles, maze wall, ice block, and fortify. Do note that defense matrix, kinetic grasp, and deflect do not block accretion though. The knockdown can be useful to interrupt ults like Whole Hog, Death Blossom, Deadeye, Barrage, Sound Barrier even, loads of stuff. Not all of them are easy or reliable to interrupt. For example, I think throwing a barrier in the face of an ulting McCree is better, but you can always barrier followed by accretion just to be safe. Accretion can also be handy for interrupting regular abilities like Mercy's Res, Roadhog's Heal, Diva's Defense Matrix, Genji's Deflect, another Sigma's Kinetic Grasp, and more. You can throw this thing directly up and hope someone walks under it, but that's kind of wacky racist stuff. It's a bit of a waste of a cooldown just for the memes. There are also some CSGO style throws you can do as well, but again, I would always take a more calculated accretion over a lucky one that may or may not get any follow-up. But there are 2 accretion techs that I think could be worth using. One is baiting cooldowns by quickly flicking to different targets. Accretion is a highly telegraphed ability, and most people are going to want to avoid it. So what you can do is make it look like you're going to hit one target and at the last second flick to another. For example, you could make it look like you're going to hit Moira to force her fade and then flick to Genji instead, killing 2 birds with 1 stone, so to speak. The other thing that can sometimes be useful is using primary fire before accretion. You used to be able to properly animation cancel this, but it's not as good as that now. This basically works the same as the primary fire melee combo. Use accretion just as the second hypersphere comes out to get a little damage on someone before the rock hits. It's kind of the same concept as Roadhog doing alternate fire before he hooks. It increases your chances of securing a kill. It's nowhere near as good as the Roadhog combo, but it's something worth using from time to time. The final ability we'll look at is, of course, Sigma's ultimate. This ultimate is definitely in the same school as Graviton Surge and Earth Shatter, and you want to use it in much the same way. For example, a guaranteed kill on a priority target is better than a 6-man ult that your team can't follow up on. In terms of numbers, Gravitic Flux does 50 damage when it lifts people up, and 50% of the hero's max health when they get slammed down. Enemies are also massively slowed for a short duration after being slammed. So 200 HP targets take 100 damage on the slam, 600 health targets take 300 damage on the slam. I haven't done any thorough testing on its interactions with stuff like Sound Barrier, but as far as I've seen, it feels like the slam just deletes Sound Barrier's health while not really affecting their real health. Let me know down in the comments if you know exactly what the interaction is here. Flux feels like a Bizarro World version of Earth Shatter. The lift and slam holds people relatively in place for longer than Reinhardt, but the fact that they're up in the air and then slammed down makes it hard for some heroes to follow up compared to Earthshatter. Some good combos include things like Deadeye, Diva Bomb, or Death Blossom, but with the last one you need to wait until they hit the ground. You can also throw something like Mines or Blizzard beneath them if you think the Flux won't be enough to win the team fight on its own. Or you can just, shoot the people in the air. All you need to do is get them to 50% health and the slam will do the rest. Honestly, I've found that fluxing one person who's out of position to keep them there and guarantee a kill can often be worthwhile. It can be tempting to go for those giant long-range ults, but if your team isn't in range to follow up, or the Flux lifts the enemy out of your team's sight lines, it's kinda useless. One exception is against Bastion comps. Lifting the whole team, including the Bastion, away from the Orisa shield might give your team an opening to actually push and win the fight. Something you should try to aim for when using Flux is, when you lift people in the air, hit a squishy with the HYPERSPHERES. That way the slam afterwards will kill them. And then on one of the slowed squishies after the slam, use your HYPERSPHERES again. If you do it right, you can get 2 kills even without any follow-up from your team. Doing it perfectly is a little bit tricky to do, but you should at least try to do it. Something to bear in mind though is how vulnerable Sigma is while using Flux. You should try to follow up on your own ultimate, but only if it's safe. Sometimes it's more important to just keep yourself alive though. Use the ultimate to pressure the enemy and make some space, even if it doesn't get an insta-kill. This is where a good Zarya can really help though. If you get a bubble as you ult, it makes it a lot safer to follow up, and you'll probably help charge up your Zarya in the process. And that just about does it for Sigma's abilities. The only thing left to talk about is Sigma's win condition. Honestly, Sigma feels best when he can take an off angle and spam his HYPERSPHERES into a group. If you can find a wall to bounce spheres off of to get the big damage in, that works too. But on a lot of maps, you kinda need to press W and rotate around the shields. If you're standing there spamming shields for too long, you're not gonna get a lot done. You need to get in and do some real damage. Pretty much every other main tank has a way to force an initiation. For example, Winston has jump, Reinhardt has shield, and Orisa has halt. Sigma, by comparison, just doesn't have an ability like that except for his ultimate. So when you're playing Sigma, you really need to find some space to get through a choke and start rotating around those shields. If you can successfully do that, you're gonna smash the enemy team. But if you're struggling to even get through the choke, Sigma is probably the worst main tank you could possibly pick. Right now, you can play hyper aggressive as Sigma and people kinda just respect your space. But I guarantee when people realize you can just push back against the Sigma and there's not a lot he can do about it, people won't just allow him to push through a choke like that. So my recommendation if you're playing against Sigma is to make it hard for his team to even get through the choke, and you'll probably have an easy game. If a full team advances on Sigma, he gets overwhelmed pretty fast. So that means if you're playing as Sigma and the enemy team gives you the tiniest bit of space, you need to take it immediately. Like I said earlier in the video, if they give you an inch, take a mile. Because once you get through that choke and you start getting weird angles on them, suddenly everyone has to play on your terms, and that's what you want. Anyway, this video has gone on way longer than I expected. I hoped to get this down to 10 minutes max, but there's just so much to Sigma, and the crazy thing is I've probably missed a bunch of stuff too. But at the very least, if you've never played Sigma before, this should give you a head start to learning him. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please feel free to subscribe for more gaming guides, news and discussion. And don't forget to check out the links below to Patreon, Discord and Twitch. Until next time, thank you for watching, and I'll see you soon.